The descent into the valley was slow and treacherous, the rocky path crumbling beneath their feet. By the time they reached the ruins, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Torian stepped cautiously over the threshold, the air inside cool and damp. The walls were covered in strange carvings, their surfaces worn smooth in places but still legible. Torian ran his fingers over the symbols, their meaning just out of reach. They felt old, older than the ruins of his village, older than the watcher in the woods. "What is this place?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Skarn growled softly, its body tense as it moved through the room. Torian followed, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The carvings continued along the walls, telling a story he couldn't quite piece together. At the far end of the room, something glinted in the fading light. Torian approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. It was a pedestal, and atop it sat a small crystal, its surface swirling with faint light. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the crystal. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. "You shouldn't touch that." The voice made him freeze. Torian spun around, his dagger drawn, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, and for a moment he thought he saw the faint outline of a figure. The whisper came again, soft and cold. "Not yet, Torian." The crystal dimmed, its light fading into darkness. Torian stood frozen, his pulse racing, as the room grew eerily silent once more. Chapter 9. A path unveiled, the ruins lay behind them, the strange whispers and the dimming crystal lingering in Torian's thoughts like a splinter. The forest was quieter now, the usual rustle of leaves and distant bird calls replaced by an unnatural stillness. Even Skarn seemed uneasy, its ears constantly twitching as its golden eyes scanned the shadows. Torian adjusted the strap of his satchel, his dagger at the ready. His mind churned with questions about the ruins, the watcher, the voice, and the crystal that had pulsed with an energy he couldn't quite understand. It was as if the wilderness itself were testing him, revealing only fragments of a puzzle he had no way to solve. "You ever feel like we're just fumbling around out here?" he asked, glancing at Skarn. The beast didn't respond, but its low growl was enough to make Torian smile faintly. "Yeah, me too." They walked in silence for a time, the path winding through thick clusters of trees and over uneven ground. The sunlight barely reached them here, casting the world in muted greens and grays. Torian's thoughts drifted back to the crystal, to the voice that had stopped him from touching it. "Not yet, Torian." The voice had been calm, almost patient, but there was something unnerving about how it had spoken his name. He shivered at the memory, gripping the wolf carving in his pocket for comfort. Whatever the ruins had been, they weren't meant to be left untouched. That much was clear. The sound of rushing water broke his thoughts, drawing his attention to a stream cutting through the trees ahead. The sight was a relief, the promise of fresh water and a moment to rest outweighing the tension that had followed him all morning. Torian knelt at the edge of the stream, cupping his hands to drink. The icy water burned his throat, but it was refreshing, a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. Skarn drank beside him, its massive frame casting a long shadow over the stream. As Torian splashed water over his face, his gaze caught something glinting beneath the surface. He frowned, leaning closer. The object was small, partially buried in the smooth stones at the bottom of the stream. He reached into the frigid water, his fingers brushing against cool metal. It was a pendant, its chain twisted and broken, but the design on its surface was unmistakable. A flame etched in intricate detail, surrounded by a circle of faintly glowing runes. "What do you think this is?" Torian asked, holding the pendant up to the light. The runes seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. He turned it over in his hands, his brows furrowing. It was beautiful, but it felt heavy, too heavy for something so small. Skarn growled softly, its gaze fixed on the pendant. Torian sighed, slipping it into his pocket. "Yeah, I know. Another mystery added to the list. As they continued their journey, the forest began to change again. The trees grew taller, their bark darker and rougher, their branches twisting unnaturally. The air felt heavier, colder, as if they were walking into a place where the sun no longer dared to shine. The path narrowed, forcing Torian and Skarn to move single file. The silence pressed down on them, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. Torian's hand never strayed far from his dagger, his eyes darting toward every shadow. "I'm getting real tired of this place," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Skarn rumbled in agreement, its ears flattening against its head. They rounded a bend in the path, and Torian froze. Ahead of them stood a figure, its form obscured by the thick mist that clung to the ground. It was humanoid, its posture hunched, its head bowed. Torian's pulse quickened as he gripped his dagger tightly, his mind racing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, its outline blurred by the mist. Skarn growled low, stepping in front of Torian, its golden eyes fixed on the figure. "Answer me!" Torian shouted, taking a step forward. The figure lifted its head slowly, and Torian's breath caught. It wasn't human. The creature's face was skeletal, its hollow eye sockets glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Its body was wrapped in tattered robes, the fabric hanging loosely over its bony frame. In its hand it held a staff carved from blackened wood, its surface etched with runes that matched the ones on the pendant in Torian's pocket. "You have come far," the creature said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing unnaturally through the forest. Its head tilted, the light in its eyes flickering. "But you tread a path you do not understand." Torian swallowed hard, his dagger trembling in his hand. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "What do you want?" The creature's gaze shifted to Skarn, then back to Torian. "I am a guide, but only for those who listen." It pointed its staff toward him, the runes flaring briefly. "The flame you carry is both your strength and your burden. Do you even know what it is?" Torian hesitated. He thought of the energy that had surged through him, the power he couldn't control. "No," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I'm trying to understand." The creature let out a sound that might have been a laugh, though it was hollow and humorless. "Understanding is earned, not given." It stepped closer, the mist swirling around its feet. "You seek strength, but you are ruled by fear. Fear of failure. Fear of what you cannot control." Torian clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I'm not afraid," he said, though the words felt hollow. The creature tilted its head again. "Lies will not serve you here." It reached out its bony hand, its fingers brushing against Torian's chest. He flinched, but the touch wasn't cold. It was warm, too warm, like the heat of a fire. The light in its eyes dimmed. "You are not ready, but you will be." Before Torian could respond, the creature dissolved into the mist, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The runes on its staff lingered for a moment, glowing faintly, before fading into nothing. Torian stood frozen, his heart pounding. Skarn nudged his arm, its growl softer now, almost concerned. He let out a shaky breath, slipping the dagger back into its sheath. "What did that mean?" he murmured, more to himself than to Skarn. His hand went to the pendant in his pocket, its surface still warm. The creature's words echoed in his mind. "You seek strength, but you are ruled by fear." He shook his head, forcing himself to move. "Come on," he said, his voice steadier now. "Let's keep going." Skarn fell into step beside him, its golden eyes glinting in the dim light. Torian's grip on the pendant tightened as they pressed on, the path ahead disappearing into the shadows. Chapter 10. The broken bridge the path twisted sharply downward, leading Torian and Skarn into a canyon carved by an ancient river. The walls rose high on either side, their jagged edges like the teeth of a great beast. The sound of rushing water echoed faintly, but when Torian looked down, the riverbed was dry, its stones bleached white by the sun. "Another dead end," Torian muttered, his voice carrying in the narrow canyon. His hand rested on the wolf carving in his pocket, his thumb tracing its worn edges. The air here felt heavier, the silence pressing down on him. Skarn sniffed the air, its ears flattening against its head. The beast's unease was palpable, and Torian tightened his grip on his dagger. "What is it?" he asked, though he didn't expect an answer. Skarn growled low in its throat, its golden eyes scanning the shadows ahead. The canyon narrowed further, the walls closing in until they were forced to walk single file. Torian's shoulders brushed against the stone, the rough surface scraping his cloak. The air grew colder, the faint scent of damp earth lingering. Ahead, the path opened into a wide chasm. Torian stopped at the edge, his breath catching. A broken bridge stretched across the gap, its stone arches crumbling with age. The far side was cloaked in shadow, the details lost in the dim light. "Well, that's inconvenient," Torian said, his voice dry. He knelt at the edge, inspecting the jagged remains of the bridge. "Doesn't look like it's been used in years." Skarn huffed softly, its gaze fixed on the far side. Torian followed its line of sight, squinting into the gloom. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, something shifting in the shadows, but it was gone before he could be sure. Torian stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "We'll have to find another way around," he said, though the thought of retracing their steps made his legs ache. The canyon walls were steep, the riverbed far below, and the bridge was their only obvious path forward. Skarn growled softly, stepping closer to the edge. Torian watched as the beast sniffed the air, its ears twitching. "You've got an idea?" he asked, though he couldn't hide the skepticism in his voice. Before he could react, Skarn leapt onto one of the remaining arches. The stone groaned under the beast's weight, but it held firm. Skarn turned to look at him, its golden eyes glinting in the dim light. "You can't be serious," Torian said, shaking his head. "That thing's barely holding together. If it collapses," Skarn growled, the sound low and insistent. Torian sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Fine," he muttered. "But if this thing gives out, I'm blaming you." The first step onto the bridge was the hardest. The stone felt brittle beneath Torian's boots, as if it might crumble at any moment. He moved slowly, his arms outstretched for balance, his heart pounding with every step. Skarn waited ahead, its body low and steady on the uneven surface. The wind picked up as they crossed, whipping at Torian's cloak and tugging at his balance. He focused on his footing, each step measured and deliberate. The chasm below yawned wide, the dry riverbed seeming farther away with every glance. "Almost there," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring himself or Skarn. Halfway across, the wind shifted. Torian froze as a deep, guttural growl echoed through the canyon. The sound wasn't Skarn's. It was something larger, more menacing. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows on the far side of the chasm. A pair of eyes appeared in the darkness, glowing red like embers. Torian's breath caught as a massive figure stepped into the light. It was a creature unlike anything he'd seen before, a hulking mass of muscle and fur, its broad shoulders hunched and its claws scraping against the stone. Its face was wolf-like, but its body was something else entirely, a twisted blend of predator and brute. "Not good," Torian said under his breath. Skarn growled, its claws digging into the stone as it crouched low, ready to fight. The creature roared, the sound reverberating through the canyon. It stepped onto the bridge, its claws tearing into the brittle stone. Torian's heart raced as he backed away, his dagger trembling in his hand. The creature moved quickly, its massive frame seeming too fast for its size. The bridge shook beneath its weight, loose stones tumbling into the chasm below. Torian's pulse pounded in his ears as he glanced back at the far side. They weren't going to make it in time. "Skarn, go!" he shouted, his voice breaking. The beast hesitated, its golden eyes darting between Torian and the creature. "I'll be right behind you. Just go." Skarn leapt toward the far side, its claws scraping against the stone as it landed. Torian turned to face the creature, his chest heaving. The energy stirred faintly in his chest, weak and unsteady. He gritted his teeth, his grip tightening on the dagger. The creature lunged, its claws slashing through the air. Torian ducked, the wind from the blow whipping past his face. He swung his dagger, the blade catching the creature's arm and leaving a faint trail of light. It roared in pain, but the wound barely slowed it. The bridge groaned beneath them, the stone cracking under the strain. Torian glanced down, his stomach twisting. The chasm seemed to stretch wider, the riverbed farther away than ever. "Come on," he muttered, his voice trembling. The energy surged again, stronger this time, and he raised the dagger as the creature charged. A burst of light erupted from the blade, slamming into the creature's chest. It howled, its body thrown back onto the crumbling bridge. The stone beneath it gave way. Torian barely had time to react as the bridge collapsed, the sound of shattering stone filling the canyon. He stumbled, his balance lost, and felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His arms flailed, his fingers grasping desperately at the edge of the remaining arch. His hand found purchase on a jagged piece of stone, and he clung to it with all his strength, his legs dangling over the chasm. The creature plummeted below, its roar fading into the distance. "Torian!" The voice was in his head, strong, insistent. He looked up to see Skarn standing at the edge, its golden eyes wide with alarm. The beast growled, lowering itself onto the edge of the bridge. "I'm fine," Torian shouted, though his arms burned from the effort of holding on. "I think." Skarn leaned over, its claws gripping the stone as it extended its neck. Torian reached up, his fingers brushing against the beast's iron-like hide. With a burst of strength, he hauled himself onto the ledge, collapsing beside Skarn as his chest heaved. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The canyon was silent, the shattered remains of the bridge scattered below. Torian sat up slowly, his body trembling from exhaustion. "Remind me never to do that again," he muttered, managing a weak smile. Skarn huffed, nudging his arm with its head. Torian laughed softly, the sound dry and tired. Yeah, thanks." He looked back at the ruins of the bridge, the weight of what had just happened settling over him. The wilderness wasn't going to let him pass easily. It wasn't just testing his strength, it was testing his resolve. Torian stood, brushing dust from his clothes. "Come on," he said, his voice steadier now. "We've got a long way to go." Skarn fell into step beside him, and together they disappeared into the shadows of the canyon. Chapter 11. A fractured horizon, the cold bit deeper as Torian and Skarn ascended into the mountain pass, the air thin and sharp with frost. Snow swirled in the wind, obscuring the path ahead. The rocks beneath their feet were slick with ice, forcing Torian to tread carefully, his boots crunching with every step. The climb felt endless. Each step drained his strength, the weight of his satchel pulling at his shoulders. His thoughts churned with questions, but no answers came. The pendant in his pocket, with its faintly glowing runes, seemed heavier with every passing hour. It was as if the object carried not just its own weight, but the burden of something far greater, something he didn't yet understand. Torian glanced at Skarn, who trudged beside him with silent determination. The beast's golden eyes gleamed faintly, scanning the trail ahead for danger. Its presence was steadying, but Torian couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. "This feels wrong," he muttered, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Like we're walking straight into a trap." Skarn huffed softly, its ears flicking toward him. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement he would get, and he managed a weak smile despite himself. "Right. I'll take that as keep going." The path narrowed as they climbed higher, the jagged cliffs rising on either side like a cage. The snow deepened, burying the trail beneath a thick, uneven blanket. Torian gritted his teeth, his legs burning as he forced himself forward. The wind howled through the pass, a low, mournful sound that carried an unnatural edge. It wasn't just the wind. It was something more, something alive. Torian felt it in his chest, a faint vibration that echoed with every gust. He stopped, his hand going to the hilt of his dagger. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Skarn growled softly, its body tensing as its golden eyes scanned the cliffs. Torian followed its gaze, his heart pounding. The shadows on the rocks seemed to shift and ripple, their movements almost imperceptible. He squinted, his breath catching as he saw it. A figure perched high above, watching them with eyes like pale fire. Before he could react, the figure leapt from the cliff, landing in the snow with a soundless grace. The figure was cloaked in tattered fabric, its form humanoid but unervingly still. Its face was obscured by a mask, smooth and featureless except for the faint glow of its eyes. It stood motionless, its presence radiating a quiet, unshakable power. Torian drew his dagger, the blade trembling in his hand. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp despite the fear tightening in his chest. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate. When it spoke, its voice was a soft whisper, carried on the wind. "You carry the spark, but you are unbalanced. You stumble where you should stand." Torian clenched his fist, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." The figure stepped closer, its feet barely disturbing the snow. "You seek strength, but you do not understand the fire within you. It burns without control, without purpose." The word struck deep, though Torian couldn't explain why. He tightened his grip on the dagger, his frustration boiling over. "Then teach me," he snapped. "If you know so much, show me what to do." The figure stopped, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Strength cannot be given. It must be earned." The figure raised its hand, and the air shifted. The wind howled louder, swirling around them in a furious vortex. Snow whipped through the air, blinding Torian and forcing him to shield his face. Skarn roared, crouching low as the ground beneath them trembled. When the wind died down, the figure was gone. In its place stood three constructs, each one towering over Torian. They were made of ice and stone, their forms crude but powerful. Their eyes glowed faintly, the same pale fire that had burned in the figure's gaze. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, the snow crunching beneath their feet. Torian's pulse pounded in his ears as the constructs advanced. His hand tingled faintly, the strange energy stirring in his chest, but it was weak, too weak to rely on. He glanced at Skarn, whose golden eyes burned with determination. "Well, this should be fun," Torian muttered, raising his dagger. The first construct swung its massive arm, the blow crashing into the ground where Torian had stood moments before. He rolled to the side, the snow damp and cold against his skin, and slashed at the creature's leg. The dagger scraped against the stone, leaving only a faint scratch. "Great," he muttered, dodging another blow. "This is going well." Skarn roared, leaping onto the second construct. Its claws raked against the creature's icy surface, sending shards flying, but the construct didn't falter. It swatted Skarn away with a heavy swing, sending the beast tumbling into the snow. "Skarn!" Torian shouted, his chest tightening. The beast growled, shaking itself off, but its movements were slower now, its strength waning. The third construct loomed over Torian, its eyes burning with cold fire. He gritted his teeth, the energy in his chest flaring weakly. It wasn't enough, not yet. He needed more. Focus. The word echoed in his mind, clear and steady. It wasn't his voice, but he didn't question it. He closed his eyes, the dagger trembling in his hand. The energy surged, stronger now, filling him with warmth. He opened his eyes, the blade in his hand glowing faintly. "Let's try this again," he muttered, The construct swung again, but this time Torian didn't dodge. He raised the dagger, the energy coursing through him, and met the blow head-on. The blade flared with light, cutting through the creature's arm as if it were paper. The construct staggered, its icy form cracking and shattering as it collapsed. Torian didn't stop. He turned to the second construct, the energy pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Skarn leapt onto the creature's back, pinning it down, and Torian drove the dagger into its chest. The construct let out a soundless roar before crumbling into shards of ice and stone. The third construct hesitated, its glowing eyes flickering. Torian stepped forward, his chest heaving, the dagger blazing in his hand. The construct took a step back, its form dissolving into snow and wind before it could be struck. The silence that followed was deafening. Torian stood in the snow, his breath clouding the air, the dagger still glowing faintly in his hand. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes steady despite the blood matting its fur. Torian knelt beside the beast, his hand resting on its iron-like skin. "You okay?" he asked softly. Skarn rumbled in response, and Torian managed a faint smile. "Yeah, me too." He looked around the pass, the wind carrying away the remains of the constructs. The figure was gone, but its words lingered. Strength cannot be given. It must be earned. Torian stood, slipping the dagger back into its sheath. The energy within him felt steadier now, more controlled, but he knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. Skarn huffed, falling into step beside him as they continued their climb. The pass stretched on, the horizon fractured and uncertain, but Torian pressed forward. The path ahead was still unknown, but he was ready to face it. Chapter 12. Trial of fire. The air shifted as Torian and Skarn emerged from the frozen pass, the biting cold giving way to an unnatural warmth. The snow beneath their feet melted into patches of mud, steam rising from cracks in the ground like faint whispers of breath. The jagged cliffs opened into a scorched valley, its surface cracked and blackened, glowing faintly with veins of molten rock. Torian slowed, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. The oppressive heat wrapped around him, pulling sweat from his skin even through his tattered cloak. The faint metallic taste of ash lingered in the air. Skarn hesitated beside him, its golden eyes narrowing as it sniffed the ground. "This doesn't feel right," Torian muttered, gripping the wolf carving in his pocket. The warmth of the valley was wrong, unnatural, as though the very ground was alive with a force that wanted them gone. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sulfur. Torian wiped his brow, the heat sapping his strength with every step. "Looks like we're not catching a break anytime soon." Skarn growled low, its ears flattening against its head. The beast's unease mirrored Torian's own, and he tightened his grip on the dagger at his side. The ground beneath them trembled as they moved deeper into the valley, the cracks widening to reveal rivers of glowing magma. Torian stepped carefully, his boots skimming over the narrow, stable sections of rock. Skarn moved ahead, its claws clicking against the stone as it scanned the path. It wasn't long before they reached the heart of the valley. A massive pit yawned before them, its edges jagged and crumbling. The molten rock inside churned like a living thing, the heat radiating in waves. Torian shielded his eyes against the glare, his heart pounding. The pit wasn't just a hazard, it was a challenge. In the center of the pit stood a platform of blackened stone, its surface etched with intricate runes that pulsed faintly with light. Hovering above the platform was a flame, small, yet impossibly bright, its flickering form casting long shadows over the molten rock. "This has to be it," Torian murmured, his voice barely audible. He felt the pull of the flame, its presence tugging at something deep within him. It wasn't just a fire, it was alive, burning with a purpose he couldn't yet understand. Skarn growled, drawing his attention to the far side of the pit. Torian's breath caught as he saw them, 3 figures emerging from the shadows. They were humanoid, their forms wreathed in flames, their eyes glowing like embers. They moved with a deliberate grace, their footsteps leaving trails of fire in their wake. Torian's hand went to his dagger, his fingers trembling. "Of course it's not that easy," he muttered. The first figure stepped forward, its voice crackling like a firestorm. "The flame calls to you, but you are not yet worthy." Torian clenched his jaw, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What does that even mean? I've made it this far. Isn't that enough?" The figure tilted its head, its burning eyes narrowing. "To wield fire is to command destruction and creation. You stumble in fear unbalanced and untested." It raised a hand, flames licking at its fingertips. "Prove yourself or be consumed." The figures moved as one, their fiery forms blurring as they surged forward. Torian barely had time to react before the first blow landed, a searing wave of heat that sent him sprawling. He rolled to the side, his hand scraping against the jagged rock as he struggled to stand. Skarn roared, launching itself at the nearest figure. Its claws raked against the creature's burning form, scattering embers, but the figure didn't falter. It struck back with a fiery fist, knocking Skarn aside with a force that shook the ground. Torian's chest heaved as he raised his dagger, the heat pressing against him like a physical weight. The energy stirred faintly in his chest, weak and unsteady. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. The figures circled him, their flames burning brighter with every step. "You want me to prove myself?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Fine, let's do this." The first figure lunged, its fiery hands outstretched. Torian sidestepped, the heat scorching his arm as he drove the dagger into its chest. The blade flared with light, the energy surging through him as the figure let out a soundless scream. Its flames flickered and dimmed, its body dissolving into ash. The second figure struck before he could recover, its hand slamming into his shoulder. Pain flared as the heat burned through his cloak, the force sending him to his knees. He gasped, the energy in his chest faltering. He felt weak, overwhelmed, as though the fire within him was slipping out of reach. Skarn roared again, tackling the third figure with a ferocity Torian had never seen. The beast's claws tore through its fiery form, scattering embers like a storm. The figure lashed out, but Skarn didn't relent, its growls echoing through the valley. Torian forced himself to his feet, his body trembling. The second figure loomed over him, its burning eyes cold and unfeeling. He gripped the dagger tightly, the energy flickering weakly in his chest. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Work." The figure raised its hand, flames coiling around its fingers. Torian closed his eyes, the heat washing over him like a wave. The energy surged suddenly, brighter and stronger than before, and he opened his eyes as the dagger blazed with light. He struck, the blade slicing through the figure's chest. The flames erupted in a brilliant flash, the figure's form disintegrating into ash. Torian staggered back, his breath ragged, his body shaking from the effort. The final figure fell under Skarn's claws, its fiery body dissolving into embers. The valley grew quiet, the oppressive heat lessening slightly. Torian dropped to his knees, the dagger slipping from his hand as he fought to catch his breath. Skarn limped toward him, its golden eyes steady despite the blood matting its fur. Torian reached out, resting a hand on the beast's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Skarn huffed softly, its breath warm against his face. Torian looked toward the platform in the center of the pit. The flame still hovered there, its light steady and unyielding. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs trembling, and stepped toward the edge. The pit seemed wider now, the molten rock churning with a restless energy. The platform called to him, the flame's presence pulling at his chest. He hesitated, his heart pounding. "What if I'm not ready?" he whispered. The flame flickered, as if answering him. Torian took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the wolf carving in his pocket. "No more waiting," he said softly. "No more running." He stepped forward. Chapter 13. The flames embraced Torian's first step onto the molten stone felt like stepping into the heart of a forge. The heat was oppressive, wrapping around him in waves that blurred the edges of his vision. The platform in the center of the pit loomed ahead, its blackened surface etched with glowing runes, the flame hovering above it like a beacon. Behind him, Skarn growled low, pacing at the edge of the pit. The beast's golden eyes followed Torian's every move, its body tense. Torian turned briefly, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Stay there," he said, his voice dry from the heat. "I'll handle this." Skarn huffed, clearly unconvinced, but it didn't move forward. Torian took another step, the stone beneath him searing his boots. He clenched his fists, his chest tight with both determination and fear. The flame called to him, its presence pulling at something deep within his core. "This is it," he muttered to himself. "No turning back now." The flame flickered as he approached, its light casting long shadows across the molten rock. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became, until it felt as though his entire body was being drawn toward the fire. He reached the edge of the platform, his breath catching as he looked up at the flame. It wasn't just fire. It was alive. The flame pulsed faintly, its edges shifting and dancing in ways that defied logic. It wasn't chaotic. It was purposeful, its movements almost hypnotic. Torian could feel its energy radiating outward, brushing against his skin like a warm breeze. "Is this what I've been looking for?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The flame seemed to respond, flickering brighter for a moment before settling again. He stepped onto the platform, the runes beneath his feet flaring to life. The air around him grew impossibly hot, and he instinctively raised a hand to shield his face. The flame surged, its light blinding, and Torian felt the energy within him stir, stronger and more vibrant than ever before. "Torian." The voice echoed in his mind, soft but commanding. He froze, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. The flame pulsed again, and the voice came once more. "You stand before the fire, untested but not unworthy. What will you do with its power?" Torian hesitated, his mind racing. He thought of the energy he'd felt before, the untamed force that had saved him more than once but had also terrified him. He thought of his village, reduced to ash, of his father's last stand, of the weight he carried, both from the past and for the future. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't even know if I'm ready for this." The flame flickered, its light softening. The fire does not demand readiness. It demands resolve. Torian clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Resolve. He had left his village to survive, to fight, to prove that he could stand when everything else had fallen. He thought of his father's words, etched into his memory. Strength doesn't come from waiting. It comes from standing, no matter how much it hurts. He took a deep breath, his gaze steadying as he looked into the heart of the flame. "Then I'm ready." The flame surged, its light enveloping him completely. Heat poured over him, searing and consuming, but it wasn't painful. It was transformative, reshaping him from the inside out. The energy in his chest erupted, filling every corner of his being with a brilliance he couldn't describe. Torian gasped, his body trembling as the fire burned through him. Images flashed in his mind, visions of the past, of the future, of things he couldn't yet comprehend. He saw his father, standing tall in the face of the soldiers. He saw Skarn, fighting by his side against impossible odds. He saw a figure cloaked in shadow, its hand outstretched toward a throne made of flame. And then he saw himself, standing in the center of it all, the fire blazing around him. When the light faded, Torian was on his knees, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. The platform beneath him was cool now, the runes dim and quiet. The flame was gone, but its presence lingered, a steady warmth in his chest. He raised a trembling hand, staring at the faint glow that pulsed beneath his skin. The energy felt different now, calmer, more controlled. It was no longer a wild, untamed force. It was his. Skarn growled softly, drawing his attention. The beast stood at the edge of the platform, its golden eyes wide with concern. Torian managed a weak smile, forcing himself to stand. "I'm okay," he said, though his voice was hoarse. "I think." Skarn stepped closer, sniffing him carefully before letting out a low rumble. Torian laughed softly, the sound dry and tired. "Yeah, I know. It's different." The path ahead felt clearer now, though no less dangerous. The valley was still, the molten rock cooling as the heat faded. Torian turned, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape. The fire had accepted him, but it had also left him with questions. The visions he'd seen, the shadowed figure, the throne of flame, were burned into his memory. What did they mean? And why did the flame feel like only the beginning? "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steadier now. "There's more out there. I can feel it." Skarn growled in agreement, falling into step beside him as they left the platform behind. The warmth in Torian's chest pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power he now carried. It was both a gift and a responsibility, a fire that could protect or destroy. Torian tightened his grip on the wolf carving in his pocket, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. Chapter 14. The whispering earthy air grew heavier as Torian and Skarn descended from the scorched valley, the heat of the fire trial giving way to a cool, damp stillness. The terrain changed dramatically. Cracked stone and molten rivers replaced by dense undergrowth and towering cliffs draped with moss. The ground beneath their feet was soft, almost spongy, and the faint scent of wet earth filled the air. Torian's grip tightened on the wolf carving in his pocket. The warmth of the fire still pulsed faintly in his chest, a steady rhythm that gave him strength. Yet, as they ventured deeper into the shadows of the cliffs, a new unease settled over him. "Feels like the forest is watching," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His words disappeared into the thick canopy above, swallowed by the dense silence. Skarn growled softly, its golden eyes darting toward the shadows. Torian glanced at the beast, his lips pressing into a thin line. "At least we agree on that." The path wound between the cliffs, narrowing until Torian had to squeeze through cracks in the stone. The moss-covered walls felt alive beneath his fingertips, damp and pulsating faintly. Every step sent a shiver down his spine, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. They emerged into a hollow at the base of the cliffs, the space ringed by ancient trees whose gnarled roots clawed at the earth. The ground was uneven, split by jagged fissures, and the air carried a faint vibration, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. Skarn growled, its hackles rising as it stepped closer to Torian. The beast's unease was palpable, and Torian's fingers brushed the hilt of his dagger. "Yeah," Torian said softly, his breath clouding in the cool air. "This doesn't feel like a coincidence." The earth beneath them rumbled faintly, a low tremor that sent loose stones skittering across the ground. Torian's pulse quickened as the vibrations grew stronger, the fissures widening until they glowed faintly with a greenish light. "Torian." The voice was soft, almost melodic, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Torian froze, his eyes darting toward the glowing fissures. "Not this again," he muttered, drawing his dagger. "Who's there?" The earth seemed to shift and ripple, the fissures flaring brighter as the ground split open. From the largest crevice emerged a figure, humanoid, but unmistakably tied to the earth itself. Its body was made of stone and moss, its surface rough and uneven, with glowing veins of green light pulsing beneath its skin. Its face was featureless save for two glowing eyes that burned with a quiet, ancient wisdom. "You carry the fire," the figure said, its voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground. "But fire alone will not sustain you. The earth must anchor what the flames would consume." Torian gritted his teeth, his dagger trembling in his hand. "I'm not here for riddles," he said sharply. "If you got something to say, say it." The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "Your fire burns bright, but it is wild and untethered. Without roots, the flame will devour all, including you. Torian opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the figure raised its hand. The ground beneath them rumbled violently, and 3 stone constructs rose from the earth, their forms rough and jagged. They moved with a lumbering grace, their glowing eyes fixed on Torian. "Prove your strength," the figure said. "Show me that you can endure." The first construct charged, its massive fists slamming into the ground where Torian had stood moments before. He rolled to the side, his heart pounding as the ground cracked beneath the force of the blow. Skarn roared, leaping onto the second construct. The beast's claws scraped against the stone, leaving deep gouges, but the construct didn't falter. It struck back with a heavy swing, forcing Skarn to retreat. Torian gripped his dagger tightly, the warmth of the fire flaring in his chest. The energy surged through him, steady and controlled, and he felt the blade grow warm in his hand. He dodged another blow, his movements quicker now, and drove the dagger into the first construct's chest. The blade flared with light, the fire bursting forth and cracking the stone. The construct crumbled into rubble, its glowing eyes dimming. "Not so tough," Torian muttered, turning to face the second construct. The ground beneath him shifted suddenly, throwing him off balance. He stumbled, barely managing to stay on his feet as the third construct struck. Its massive fist grazed his side, sending him sprawling. Pain flared through his ribs, and he gasped, his vision blurring. Skarn lunged at the second construct, its claws raking through the glowing veins of light. The construct shuddered, its movements slowing as Skarn struck again and again. Finally, the beast drove its claws into the construct's chest, shattering it into pieces. Torian pushed himself to his feet, his chest heaving. The third construct loomed over him, its glowing eyes burning with an eerie intensity. He raised his dagger, the fire surging stronger now, but before he could strike, the construct swung again. The blow never landed. The ground beneath the construct erupted, roots coiling around its legs and dragging it down. The green light in the fissures flared brightly, and the construct shuddered before collapsing into rubble. Torian stared, his breath ragged. The figure stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "You are stronger than you believe," it said, its voice quieter now. "But strength alone will not see you through. The earth will guide you, but you must be willing to listen." Torian frowned, his grip on the dagger loosening. "What does that mean?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, and the ground beneath Torian's feet shifted. He stumbled, his vision blurring as the light from the fissure surrounded him. When it cleared, the hollow was gone. Torian found himself standing at the edge of a dense forest, the towering cliffs behind him. The warmth of the fire still pulsed in his chest. But now it was joined by something else, a steady, grounding presence that felt like the earth itself. Skarn growled softly, nudging his arm. Torian looked down at the beast, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm okay." He turned his gaze to the forest ahead, his resolve hardening. The fire had accepted him, and now the earth had shown him its strength. But there was still more to learn, more to face. "Come on," he said, stepping forward. "Let's see what's next." Chapter 15. The tempest edged the forest ahead of Torian, and Skarn was dense, its trees stretching skyward like pillars of an ancient cathedral. Unlike the scorched valley or the trembling hollow of the earth, this place felt alive with motion. The air was crisp and electric, charged with energy that made the hairs on Torian's arms stand on end. Leaves rustled in unseen winds, and the faint hum of a distant storm echoed through the canopy. Torian adjusted the strap of his satchel, the warmth of the fire and the grounding presence of the earth steadying him as he stepped forward. Skarn padded beside him, its ears flicking at every shift in the wind. The beast's golden eyes were sharp, its movements cautious but confident. "Feels like the wind's carrying something," Torian muttered, brushing a hand through his hair as a sudden gust whipped past him. He tightened his grip on the dagger at his side, its blade faintly warm beneath his fingers. I'm guessing it's not good news. Skarn huffed softly, its claws scraping against the roots that twisted across the forest floor. Torian managed a weak smile. Right, onward it is. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their branches intertwining above to form a natural ceiling that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler, the distant hum of the storm growing louder. Torian felt the wind tugging at him now, playful but insistent, as though urging him forward. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a clearing. The space was circular, the ground covered in soft moss that glowed faintly in the dim light. At the center stood a lone figure, its back turned to them. The figure was tall and slender, cloaked in a garment that rippled as though caught in an unseen breeze. Its hair, long and silver, seemed to flow like liquid wind. Torian froze, his pulse quickening. Skarn growled low, stepping protectively in front of him. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by a mask of swirling clouds. When it spoke, its voice was a whisper of a gale, soft yet impossible to ignore. You carry the flame and the earth's strength, but you cannot grasp the winds. Why have you come? Torian hesitated, gripping the wolf carving in his pocket. I'm trying to understand, he said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming in his chest. I don't know why this is happening, but I can't stop now. The figure tilted its head, its mask shimmering faintly. Understanding comes not from pursuit, but from surrender. The wind does not move because it is chased. It moves because it is free. Torian frowned. That doesn't make any sense. The figure's voice grew firmer, the wind swirling around them. Then let the wind teach you. The air shifted suddenly, the wind roaring to life. Leaves and branches swirled in a violent spiral, and Torian staggered back, his arms raised to shield his face. The figure dissolved into the gale, its form scattering like mist. The clearing was no longer still. 3 whirlwinds formed, their centers glowing faintly with blue light. They twisted and writhed, their movements erratic and wild. The ground beneath Torian trembled as the whirlwind surged toward him. Of course, he muttered, drawing his dagger. It's never easy. The first whirlwind struck, its force slamming into Torian like a wall of air. He stumbled, his boots skidding across the mossy ground as he fought to regain his footing. The wind howled, tearing at his cloak and hair, and he gritted his teeth against its fury. Skarn roared, leaping at the second whirlwind. The beast's claws slashed through the swirling air, disrupting its form but not dissipating it entirely. The whirlwind recoiled, twisting toward Skarn with renewed intensity. The third whirlwind circled them, its movements fast and unpredictable. Torian's chest heaved as he raised his dagger, the energy within him flickering weakly. The fire and earth had given him strength, but this was different. This was chaos. The first whirlwind surged again, its force threatening to knock Torian off his feet. He dodged to the side, his dagger cutting through the air, but the blade met no resistance. The wind reformed instantly, its glowing core flaring brighter. Torian clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "What am I supposed to do?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. A voice whispered in his mind, faint but clear. "You do not fight the wind. You move with it." He froze, the dagger trembling in his hand. Move with it. The words echoed in his mind, resonating with something deep inside him. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire and the grounding presence of the earth steadying him. When the whirlwind struck again, he didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped into its path, his movements fluid and deliberate. The wind roared around him, but he didn't resist. He let it carry him, his body moving with the current. The whirlwind faltered, its form shuddering as it passed through him. Torian opened his eyes, the dagger in his hand glowing faintly. He turned to face the glowing core of the whirlwind, his movements calm and precise. "Let's see if this works," he muttered, He stepped forward, his blade slicing through the air. This time, the dagger found its mark, striking the core of the whirlwind. The glow flared brightly before the whirlwind collapsed, its force dissipating into the still air. The second and third whirlwinds hesitated, their movements slowing. Skarn growled, its claws tearing through the second whirlwind as Torian moved toward the third. He felt the wind pulling at him, but this time he didn't resist. He moved with it, his steps light and deliberate. The dagger struck the core of the third whirlwind, and it shattered into fragments of light. Skarn finished the second, its roar echoing through the clearing as the final traces of the storm faded. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Torian lowered his dagger, his chest heaving. The energy within him felt different now, lighter, freer, as though the fire, earth, and wind were no longer separate but part of a greater whole. He turned to Skarn, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not bad," he said, his voice hoarse. Skarn huffed softly, its golden eyes glinting in the fading light. The clearing shifted, the moss glowing brighter as the wind returned to a gentle breeze. The figure reappeared, its form shimmering like a mirage. It nodded once, its voice softer now. "You have learned. The wind moves through you now, as it should." Torian frowned, his grip tightening on the dagger. "What happens now?" The figure tilted its head. "You continue forward. The winds have shown you the path. It is yours to walk." Before Torian could respond, the figure dissolved once more, leaving only the whisper of the breeze. The energy in his chest pulsed faintly, steady and harmonious, and he felt a newfound clarity settle over him. He looked toward the edge of the clearing, where a narrow path wound through the trees. The way forward was clear now, but the challenges ahead were still unknown. Torian slipped the dagger into its sheath, his gaze steady. "Come on," he said to Skarn, stepping onto the path. "We're not done yet." Skarn fell into step beside him, its movements confident and calm. Together, they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the wind guiding their way. Chapter 16. The convergence, the forest grew quieter as Torian and Skarn moved deeper into the narrow path, the wind's gentle whispers fading into stillness. The air carried a subtle weight, as if the world were holding its breath. Torian steps slowed, his senses sharp and attuned to the quiet energy around him. He could feel the fire in his chest burning steady, the earth grounding him, and the wind brushing lightly against his thoughts. For the first time, the elements weren't battling for control, they coexisted, weaving through him like threads of the same fabric. But something was different now. Ahead, the path seemed darker, its edges blurred and uncertain. The air smelled faintly of ash, damp soil, and the sharp tang of ozone. Torian tightened his grip on his dagger, his fingers brushing the wolf carving in his pocket. "Something's coming," he murmured. Skarn growled low, its golden eyes narrowing as it scanned the shadows. Torian glanced at the beast, nodding. "Stay close." The path opened into a wide clearing, its edges marked by jagged stone pillars covered in glowing runes. The ground was uneven, shifting between scorched earth, patches of moss, and loose gravel that crunched beneath Torian's boots. At the center of the clearing stood a massive obelisk, its surface cracked and weathered, yet pulsing faintly with light. The obelisk hummed with a deep, resonant energy, the sound vibrating through Torian's chest. He took a hesitant step forward, his gaze fixed on the glowing runes. The symbols felt familiar, as though they were part of something he had always known but couldn't quite remember. "This has to be it," he said softly, more to himself than to Skarn. The beast stood at his side, its body tense, its claws digging into the loose earth. As Torian stepped closer to the obelisk, the air grew heavier, pressing against him like a physical force. The warmth of the fire, the strength of the earth, and the freedom of the wind surged within him, each one pulsing in time with the light from the obelisk. The runes flared brighter, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. A deep voice echoed through the clearing, low and commanding. "The elements converge, but balance is not yet achieved. Are you prepared to face the truth, Torian? Torian froze, his heart pounding. Who's there? He called out, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest. What truth? The air shimmered, and 3 figures emerged from the shadows. Each one embodied an element, fire, earth, and wind. Its form humanoid but distinctly otherworldly. Their glowing eyes burned with intensity as they moved toward him, their presence radiating power. The figure of fire stepped forward, its voice crackling like embers. You wield the flame, but do you understand its cost? The figure of earth followed, its voice deep and steady. You stand grounded, but have you embraced the weight of responsibility? The figure of wind spoke last, its voice a soft but insistent whisper. You feel the freedom of the breeze, but do you trust it to guide you? Torian gritted his teeth, his dagger trembling in his hand. I'm trying, he said, his voice firm. I'm doing everything I can to understand. What else do you want from me? The 3 figures exchanged a glance, their forms flickering faintly. The figure of fire stepped closer, its heat brushing against Torian's skin. You must prove that you can unite the elements, or they will destroy you. The clearing erupted into chaos. The ground split open as roots surged upward, twisting toward Torian with terrifying speed. The wind roared, forming a whirlwind that tore through the clearing, scattering debris. Flames burst to life, their heat searing the air as they coiled and lashed like living creatures. Torian staggered back, his chest heaving as the 3 figures circled him. Skarn roared, leaping at the nearest root and tearing it apart with its claws. The beast's golden eyes burned with determination as it fought to protect him. The energy within Torian flared, each element surging wildly. The fire burned too hot, threatening to consume him. The earth pressed down, heavy and unyielding. The wind howled in his ears, pulling him in every direction at once. He dropped to his knees, his hands clutching his chest. I can't, he gasped, his voice breaking. It's too much. A faint voice echoed in his mind, calm and steady. Balance, Torian. Find the balance. Torian closed his eyes, his breath shallow and quick. The elements raged around him, each one demanding his attention, pulling him apart. He thought of the fire trial, the strength he had found in its flame. He thought of the earth's trial, the resilience that had steadied him. And he thought of the wind's trial, the freedom he had embraced. The energy surged again, but this time he didn't resist. He let it flow through him, each element finding its place, weaving together into something greater. The fire burned steady, its warmth a source of strength. The earth grounded him, its weight anchoring him to the present. The wind moved freely, guiding him forward. Torian opened his eyes, the glow from the obelisk reflecting in them. The chaos around him slowed, the flames dimming, the roots retreating, the wind softening to a gentle breeze. He stood, his dagger glowing brightly in his hand, and faced the 3 figures. I understand now, he said, his voice firm. I'm not fighting the elements. I'm part of them. The figures paused, their forms flickering as they exchanged a silent glance. The figure of fire stepped forward, its flames burning lower. You have learned. The elements are not tools. They are allies. Together, they are your strength. The figure of earth spoke next, its voice quieter now. But strength is not without cost. You must choose how to wield it. The figure of wind nodded, its form dissolving into the breeze. And you must trust the path it reveals. The 3 figures faded, their presence lingering in the air like an echo. The light from the obelisk flared one final time before dimming, its surface cracking and crumbling. Torian stood in the clearing, his chest heaving as the energy within him settled. It was different now, steady, balanced, and whole. He turned to Skarn, who stood beside him, its golden eyes watching him closely. We did it, Torian said softly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Skarn huffed, nudging his arm. Torian laughed quietly, the sound dry but genuine. Yeah, I know. There's still more to do. The path ahead was clearer now. the shadows of the forest retreating as the energy within Torian guided him forward. The trials had shown him the power of fire, the strength of earth, and the freedom of wind. But the journey was far from over. As Torian and Skarn stepped into the light, he tightened his grip on the wolf carving in his pocket. The elements were his now, but so was the responsibility that came with them. The descent into the valley was slow and treacherous, the rocky path crumbling beneath their feet. By the time they reached the ruins, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Torian stepped cautiously over the threshold, the air inside cool and damp. The walls were covered in strange carvings, their surfaces worn smooth in places but still legible. Torian ran his fingers